The millionaire's daughter hadn't smiled in 3 years. Not until a woman with calloused hands and a red scarf stepped quietly through the door. At 7:03 a.m., the mansion breathed its usual silence. Cold light pooled across marble floors, crawling up the tall walls of a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Outside, the sky was an uninspired gray, the kind of colorless morning that made even the sun seem tired. Inside, Sophie Lawson sat by the window, as she always did, unmoving. 10 years old, hair tangled, eyes blank, a child carved in wax, more memory than flesh. Downstairs, the clock ticked like a funeral drum. Somewhere behind closed doors, her father, Michael Lawson, was finishing his coffee without tasting it. He hadn't gone upstairs in 3 years. Once upon a time, he had a wife, a daughter who ran barefoot through the halls, a family worth more than any business deal. But then came the accident, a sharp curve, screaming tires, the smell of burning rubber and broken glass. Emily died instantly. Sophie survived, but not unscathed. Michael was driving, and so he built a new life out of avoidance. Mornings spent escaping, evenings arriving late, hoping she'd already fallen asleep. A father who existed only in shadows, too afraid to face the reflection in her eyes. Emily's eyes, soft with forgiveness and pain he couldn't carry. Sophie never walked again. Or maybe she simply chose not to. But the house didn't mourn loudly. It didn't collapse under grief. It just froze. Time stopped knocking. Windows stayed shut. And warmth became a stranger. Only Clara Brown remained. Loyal housekeeper, quiet keeper of ghosts. She wiped down dustless counters, folded linens never touched, and stood guard over the silence like a soldier too old to retire. And then came Grace. She arrived in the rain, stepping through the iron gate with her son's umbrella and nothing else but a smile that didn't seem to understand the rules of this house. Worn coat, second-hand shoes, a red scarf like a flag in a war no one was fighting anymore. Clara met her at the door, and something in that handshake, warm, rough, unafraid, breathed life into a hallway that hadn't known a heartbeat in years. Grace didn't have credentials, no degrees, no references, no polished speech. Just a line on her application. Former dance teacher. Widow. One son. She was hired instantly. Michael never asked. He wouldn't have cared. For the first week, Grace kept her head down, sweeping floors already clean and dusting frames with the faces turned down. She moved through the mansion like a whisper, present but never pressing. But she watched, and she listened. She heard the crying first, a muffled sound behind a locked door upstairs. A broken sob that caught on the wallpaper like a spider's web. "Who's in there?" she asked. Clara sighed. "The master's daughter. She won't let anyone in. Not anymore." Grace nodded, said nothing. But inside, something shifted. She knew that kind of silence. The kind born from pain that had no words. She'd heard it in her own kitchen after the accident. After Thomas never came home. 2 weeks passed. Grace worked double shifts, mornings at the mansion, afternoons at a diner, nights cleaning offices. A woman stitched together by exhaustion, hope, and the quiet refusal to give up. "You ever rest?" Clara asked one morning, watching her scrub the kitchen tiles. Grace smiled, wiping sweat from her brow. "If I stop, I might not be able to start again." "How old's your boy?" 16. "Ethan. Smarter than I'll ever be. He tells me to work less." She chuckled. But Rent doesn't care about smart. One morning, earlier than usual, Grace paused outside Sophie's room. Something pulled her toward it. A voice, or maybe just instinct. She knocked. "I told you not to come in," came the small, frightened voice. Grace leaned against the door. "I'm Grace. I just wanted to say hello." "Why?" "Because I think you've been alone too long." A pause. Then, softer. "You can come in." The room was dim. Toys untouched. Drawings half finished. A little girl sat by the window, staring out at nothing. "Hi," Grace said gently. Sophie didn't turn. "Hi." Grace didn't sit on the bed. She sat on the floor, lower than the girl's eye level. "I used to be alone, too. It's hard, isn't it?" Sophie glanced sideways, eyes suspicious. "Don't you have friends?" "I have a son. He's at school most days. I work the rest of the time." "Do you have a husband?" "No. He died 5 years ago." Sophie's voice trembled. "My mom died too." Grace didn't offer platitudes. She opened her arms. Sophie leaned into her like a falling branch finally allowed to break. And for the first time since the accident, someone in that room wept without shame. They drew together after that. Clumsy sketches, flowers with crooked stems, a cat that looked like a donut. Grace's laugh made Sophie giggle, and that giggle turned into a ripple of something larger, something that reached Clara downstairs and made her hand tremble over her teacup. Laughter. Real, living laughter. And then it happened. Michael Lawson, returning early from a canceled meeting, stepped through the door expecting silence. Instead, he heard music. Not from a stereo. From a child's laugh and a woman's voice teasing her gently. He climbed the stairs slowly, like a man approaching a dream he didn't trust. Through the crack of Sophie's door, he saw them, his daughter, alive again, cheeks flushed, eyes wide, drawing pink clouds with a stranger. A woman who sat on the floor like it was the only place worth being. And for the first time in 3 years, Michael Lawson didn't feel like the master of a mansion. He felt like a man who had missed something unspeakably precious. He backed away, closed the door quietly, then whispered down the hall. "Clara." She appeared instantly. "Yes, sir." "That woman. Who is she?" "Grace Miller, the new cleaner." He repeated the name like a prayer he didn't know how to say. That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Michael sat in his office staring at an old photograph. Emily, Sophie, and himself, smiling before everything broke. He ran his fingers across the glass and whispered, "Can you hear that, Emily? Our daughter is laughing again." He didn't know what Grace Miller had done, but he knew what she had undone, and that was something no amount of money could ever buy. The garden had forgotten how to bloom, but something was stirring. It began with the roses, tight little buds, barely noticeable at first, pushing out from dead stems like secrets the earth had kept to itself. Grace noticed them before anyone else. She always did. She moved among the flower beds every morning with quiet reverence, trimming the brittle ends, clearing room for something new. That morning, she looked up mid-snip and saw Sophie. Not just watching, waving. Her small hand was pressed to the upstairs window like a seal. Her face lit up, not with the pale, polite smile of routine, but with something alive. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Then she lifted her hand and waved back. Sunlight caught her red scarf, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Inside, Sophie turned from the window with something new pulsing beneath her ribs. A reason. "Miss Grace," she said later, wheeling herself into the kitchen, "I want to draw something." Grace set a dish towel down. "All right, what shall we draw today?" "I want to draw Mommy." The kitchen paused. The faucet still dripped, the fridge still hummed, but for a second, the moment held its breath. Grace didn't answer right away. She wiped her hands dry, walked over, and knelt beside Sophie's chair. "Then let's draw her. I don't remember her face perfectly anymore." Grace touched the girl's arm gently. "Then draw how she made you feel. That's even better." That afternoon, Michael returned home early. Not because of a canceled meeting. Not by accident. He wanted to be home. He walked into the sitting room and froze. Sophie sat on the floor surrounded by markers, crayons, and torn paper edges. Her hair was tied back in a crooked ponytail. She looked up and smiled, a real smile, and held out a paper. "Look, Daddy." He crouched slowly, like approaching something sacred. On the page, a woman with brown hair stretched her arms toward a man and a little girl in a wheelchair. The sky was purple, the grass orange, the trees full of hearts. "Mom's still here," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "We just can't see her." He stared at the drawing. Words failed him. Then he pulled Sophie close and buried his face in her shoulder. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I went too far away while you were still here waiting for me." "It's okay, Daddy," she murmured. "Mommy's always between us." At the doorway, Grace stood unseen. Her fingers clutched the fabric of her apron like a lifeline. She watched the embrace for a few moments, then quietly turned and slipped away. She never stayed to claim the moment. She just created space for others to return to it. From that day forward, the house began to change. Not with fanfare, not suddenly. Like morning sunlight creeping over cold stone, slow, persistent, soft. Michael no longer rushed to leave. He took breakfast in the kitchen. He watched Sophie eat. He complimented Clara's coffee. He laughed, once, when Grace dropped a spoon. The sound startled everyone, including him. He didn't know how to be warm. But he tried. Grace stayed longer, though she never said why. Sophie began to talk more, ask questions, make requests. Can I wear the blue dress today? Can we bake cookies again? Clara nearly cried the first time Sophie asked for seconds. And then one Sunday morning, Miss Grace? Grace looked up from tying Sophie's shoes, even though the girl still couldn't walk far. Yes, sweetheart. Can Ethan come visit? Grace blinked. Ethan, you talk about him. I want to meet him. He taught you how to mix colors, right? Grace smiled softly. Yes, he did. But he's 16. Teenagers aren't very exciting. I want to meet him anyway. And Daddy should too. Michael, nearby with a newspaper, looked up. There was a brief hesitation, then a nod. If that's what you want, Sophie, we'll invite him. Ethan Miller arrived 2 afternoons later. He wore worn sneakers and a second-hand hoodie, sleeves too short for his long arms. His hair needed trimming, but he carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from watching your mother struggle and learning never to complain. Sophie met him at the door like a hostess at a royal banquet. Come in. We're drawing dragons today. Ethan chuckled, unsure. Okay, I'm terrible at dragons. That's okay. Grace can't draw cats. Ethan sat cross-legged beside her on the rug. Grace watched from the hallway, trying not to fuss, while Michael lingered near the doorway, watching silently. The 2 kids bent over their drawings, giggling, whispering, their laughter rising in tiny bursts. Sophie drew a castle. Ethan added a blue-eyed dragon that looked like it had eaten too many cookies. Sophie shrieked with laughter. Michael turned toward Grace. She was watching Ethan, a hand over her mouth, her eyes wet. Your son is a good boy, he said quietly. He's my reason, she replied. Michael looked back at the pair on the floor. She hasn't laughed like that in. I don't know if she ever has. He paused, then added softly, thank you. Grace shook her head. Don't thank me. Just don't forget. The days flowed into each other. Winter receded. The air smelled of soil and soft green things. Sophie began walking short distances. 3 steps, 5, 7 with support. Each one a triumph shouted from the stairs. Grace, I did it. Come see. Grace always came. Clara began baking bread again. She started leaving the kitchen door open. Birds returned to the windowsills. Sophie gave them names. Ethan visited more often. He helped Michael with spreadsheets, but mostly he stayed for Sophie. And for Grace. Michael began to open up, sharing stories of Emily, of college days, of things he'd long buried under work and regret. Grace never interrupted. She simply listened, her hands always busy, chopping vegetables, folding linens, trimming the roses. She didn't push. She didn't preach. She made space. One afternoon, as sunset spilled across the back garden, Michael found her pruning the roses again. You always know how to make things come alive, he said. Grace smiled without looking up. Sometimes you just have to cut away the parts that are already dead. He stepped closer. I thought I was helping Sophie by building a bigger company, by hiring the best therapists. But all she ever needed was someone to sit with her. Grace looked at him now. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a child is not fix them. Just love them as they are. Michael swallowed hard. You've done more than that. She shrugged. Maybe. But Sophie helped me too. She made me remember how to laugh. Their eyes met. And in that glance, something passed between them. It wasn't romance. Not yet. But something real. Something neither of them had expected to grow in the silence of an old house full of ghosts. The day Sophie took 10 steps on her own, the house went completely still. No music. No fanfare. Just Clara gasping into her apron, Grace covering her mouth, and Michael dropping his phone on the floor. Sophie stood, cheeks flushed, arms out like wings, knees trembling. I'm doing it, she squeaked, her voice breaking with both triumph and terror. Michael reached her just as she started to sway. He caught her, not like glass, but like something heavy he'd finally been allowed to hold. I saw you, he whispered, kneeling, clutching her tight. I saw everything. Sophie beamed. I walked, Daddy. He didn't cry this time. His face said more than tears could. Grace turned her face to the window. No one saw her cry, but she did. Quietly. The kind of tears that taste like relief. That night, the mansion didn't feel large. It felt full. Clara baked cinnamon rolls, claiming it was to warm the place up, but the truth was in her eyes. She was celebrating. Ethan arrived after his evening shift and found Sophie waiting at the top of the stairs. I walked, she said simply. I know, he smiled. Everyone at school does. They sat on the floor together and colored a badge that read, Walking Club, founding member, Sophie Lawson. Grace laughed when she saw it. Michael framed it. Something had changed. Not just in the house. In him. Michael had spent so long punishing himself that he no longer remembered how it felt to wake up without guilt pressing into his ribs. But lately, something was lifting. He spent mornings in the kitchen, sipping lukewarm coffee while Sophie teased Clara. He began to speak more, even laugh occasionally. His voice lost its edge. One morning, he told Sophie, "When you were born, you had more hair than any baby I'd ever seen. Your mother said it was proof you'd be wild." Was I? Still are? They both laughed. Grace, overhearing from the hallway, paused. Then smiled. There it was, the sound of a family trying again. A week later, on a rainy Tuesday, Grace brought a picnic blanket and a dented metal basket into the kitchen. "What's that?" Sophie asked. "Lunch," she said. "But outside." Michael looked up from his laptop. "It's pouring. It's only drizzling. Besides, we'll eat under the tree." Clara raised an eyebrow. "The tree Emily planted?" Grace nodded. "Is that allowed?" Michael asked. "Of course not," Grace said, and smiled. "That's why it's perfect." They set up under the old oak in the back garden. Clara insisted on bringing proper plates. Ethan held an umbrella until Sophie told him to quit acting like a butler. Grace had packed simple food, sandwiches, lemon cookies, a thermos of sweet tea. But everything tasted richer out there, under dripping branches, shoes in wet grass, laughter bouncing off rose bushes. "I think this is the best picnic I've ever been to," Sophie said. "It's the only picnic you've ever been to," Michael teased. "Still counts." He looked at Grace across the spread. "You always do this. Turn something small into something unforgettable." She didn't answer, but her eyes met his. And for a second, nothing else existed. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Michael wandered into the kitchen alone. He poured himself a drink he didn't need and stood by the window watching rain slide down the glass. Clara entered quietly, drying her hands. "I had her followed," he said suddenly. Clara stopped mid-step. "Grace." He nodded. "When she first arrived, I thought," he trailed off. "I thought no one could be that kind for free." Clara's voice was cool. "So you assumed she must be hiding something." "I was wrong." "Yes." He looked down. "Do you think she knows?" Clara sighed. "She's not stupid. She knows." But she stayed. Michael looked out into the dark garden. "Why would she stay?" Clara dried a glass slowly. "Maybe because she's been alone, too. Maybe because Sophie matters more than your mistakes." He looked over. "You're saying I don't deserve her. I'm saying none of us do. That's what Grace is." The next day, Michael stood in the garden waiting. Grace arrived early, as always. Her scarf was different, dark green, almost like forest moss. She smiled when she saw him, but then paused at the look on his face. "I was wrong," he said. "About you." She tilted her head, uncertain. "I thought you were hiding something. That no one could do what you did without wanting something in return. I didn't understand." She waited. "I do now." He stepped closer, voice low. "You walked into a house full of ghosts, and instead of being scared, you opened the windows." Grace's face didn't change, but something in her shoulders softened. "I didn't do much," she said. "You did everything." A pause. "I had you followed," he confessed. She didn't flinch, just looked at him. "I'm sorry," he added. "It wasn't about you. It was about me. I didn't trust kindness. I thought it was a trick." Grace's voice was steady. "That's not new. Most people don't. But you stayed, even when you knew." "Because I saw Sophie," she said. "And because I saw you. Not the man hiding behind the work. The one trying to come back." Another pause. "Can I start again?" he asked. "With you." Grace blinked slowly. "You don't need to ask permission to be human, Michael." He looked at her. For a moment, his mouth opened, like he might say more, but he didn't. And somehow, that said enough. Over the next few weeks, Sophie's legs grew stronger. She practiced walking down the hallway, balancing with one hand against the wall. Ethan became her unofficial coach. "Left, right, stop wobbling." "I'm not wobbling." "You're wobbling like a baby giraffe." Grace watched them and laughed until she cried. Michael started joining them for dinner. He brought stories from work, some dull, some hilarious. Sophie rolled her eyes and called him a dad joke machine. Grace just smiled, eyes soft in the candlelight. One night, after dessert, Sophie stood without help. Everyone went silent. "Okay," she said, wobbling. "Someone clap, or I'll fall." They clapped. All of them. Loud and messy and real. That night, Sophie whispered to Grace while brushing her teeth. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" Grace crouched beside her, brushing the girl's hair. She'd be proud of everything. Even the bad drawings. Especially those. One weekend, Grace found Michael waiting by the rose bushes. "Do you believe in second chances?" he asked. She paused. "No." He looked at her, surprised. "I believe in new beginnings," she said. He smiled slowly. "What's the difference?" "Second chances mean fixing something broken. New beginnings mean starting with hope." He didn't reply, but he didn't need to. Because in the golden silence of the garden, with roses blooming and shadows growing long, they both knew. They weren't trying to fix what was lost. They were planting something entirely new. The roses bloomed early that year. Soft petals, pale and fragrant, pushed through vines once left for dead. Sophie named each one Hope, Brave, Sunshine, and Emily. She tied little ribbons around their stems, saying it helped them grow. Clara didn't argue. She just smiled, wiped her eyes, and trimmed carefully around the names with reverence. Inside the house, spring wasn't a season, it was a mood. Every hallway had life in it. Doors were open. Curtains fluttered. Clara hummed as she worked, her old steps lighter than they'd been in years. The kitchen was never quiet anymore. Sophie's shoes, real ones, not slippers, clicked against the floor as she walked carefully, methodically, like someone writing a new chapter with each step. There were no miracles here, only progress. And that was more beautiful. Sophie could walk without help now. 10, then 20, then 40 steps across the garden path. Ethan counted them aloud, clapping each time, while Grace documented everything in a little green notebook titled Small Victories. One quiet Saturday morning, Michael stood by the window in his study, coffee forgotten in his hand, watching Sophie walk across the garden. Her strides were uneven, still cautious, but they were hers. Grace stood nearby, holding a small bouquet of the first full blooms. Ethan helped Clara adjust the bird feeder. The image was so ordinary it ached. Michael sat down, staring at the photo still on his desk, himself, Emily, and baby Sophie in the old garden. A different life. A different man. He touched the glass. "I wish you could see them now," he said aloud. Then he stood up and left the photo behind. Later that day, Sophie rolled up a drawing and handed it to Grace with both hands. "It's you," she said. "You're a tree. Strong. And everyone's underneath you." Grace unfolded the paper, staring at the image. A tall tree, arms like branches, sheltering a boy, a girl, a man, and a little baby with flowers in her hair. "Who's that?" Grace asked, pointing. "That's Emma," Sophie said simply. Grace blinked. "Who's Emma?" "You'll see." Sophie grinned and ran off. Grace found out 3 days later, alone in the bathroom, early morning light barely peeking through the fogged window, a test strip in her shaking hand. She sat on the edge of the tub for 10 minutes, completely still. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just breathed. Michael knew something had changed. She was quieter that week. Not distant, just inward. Finally, one evening after dinner, when Sophie had gone to bed and Ethan was helping Clara prepare for the next day, Michael found Grace in the garden, standing beneath the old oak tree. "You're avoiding me," he said softly. She didn't deny it. He waited. Then she turned to him and said, "I'm pregnant." The words landed like wine through dry leaves. Gentle, but impossible to ignore. Michael stepped back slightly. Not from fear. From sheer surprise. "I didn't," he began, then stopped. Are you okay?" Grace nodded. "Yes." He looked at her, his voice quieter. "Do you want this?" "I didn't expect it," she said. "But now that I know, yes, I do." Michael breathed out slowly. "Okay, just that." And Grace exhaled with him. They didn't rush into marriage. Neither needed fanfare. But when spring warmed into summer, Michael stood beside Grace beneath the oak tree in a garden bursting with color. No white dress. No orchestra. Just close friends, blooming roses, and the echo of healing. Sophie was the maid of honor. Ethan the best man. Clara stood in the background, holding a handkerchief and muttering that she wasn't crying, just dust in the air. Michael looked at Grace and said, "I won't promise you forever. I'll promise you today, and every day I have left." Grace said nothing for a moment, then quietly added, "That's more than I ever expected, and everything I need." They exchanged rings beneath Emily's tree. and the wind carried her name gently between the leaves, not as a ghost, but as a blessing. Emma was born the following March. She came early, small, quiet at first, but when she opened her eyes, the entire house fell silent. She had Grace's cheeks, Michael's brow, and Sophie's stubbornness in the way she refused to sleep without being held. Ethan cried when he held her. "She's got a grip like a clamp," he whispered. "She's going to build robots and rule the world." Sophie looked at her baby sister and said, "We'll call her Emma, after the first rose that bloomed." And that was that. Time passed, not quickly, not slowly, just enough. Ethan went off to university, but came home often. He sent sketches of campus trees and bridge blueprints for Sophie to color. Sophie walked more each week, then ran, then danced, clumsily, joyfully, freely. On her 12th birthday, she performed a one-girl show in the garden, wearing a paper crown and calling herself Queen of Getting Back Up. Michael grew softer, less businessman, more father. He worked from home more, built a greenhouse, read bedtime stories again. Grace remained the same. She woke early, made tea, wrote in her little notebook. She was still the calm center of the house, now with a baby strapped to her chest as she washed dishes and hummed lullabies that Sophie once wept to. And Clara? Clara finally took a week off, the first in 30 years. She went to the coast, came back with sea salt in her hair and stories about a sailor who made her laugh. "You should marry him," Grace teased. "He's got bad knees," Clara replied. "But we'll see." One quiet evening, with Emma asleep in Grace's arms and Sophie chasing fireflies across the grass, Michael sat beside his wife on the porch swing. He reached over and took her hand, weathered and warm. "You saved us," he said. "No," she replied. "You just stopped running." He looked at her. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Grace thought for a moment. "No, I carry it with me, like a scar. But this is the life I never knew I deserved." They rocked slowly, the sound of laughter and summer insects filling the air around them. "Do you think Emily would be okay with this?" Michael asked, almost afraid to say her name aloud. Grace didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "I think Emily wanted you to live." He nodded. So did Sophie. So did I. And now, finally, he was. Years later, the Lawson mansion would be known not for its size or its wealth, but for its garden. Children played beneath the oak. Artists painted the roses. A plaque on the gate read, "What blooms after winter matters most." Inside, on the mantel, stood 3 photographs. One of Emily, with baby Sophie in her lap, smiling at the wind. One of Grace, arms wide, catching Emma mid-run. And in the middle, a family, blended, bruised, but whole, laughing under the tree that saw everything and forgot nothing. Because sometimes the best endings are really just quiet, beautiful beginnings.